The moment Clara Bennett stepped off the wagon and onto the main street of Red Hollow, the first thing she heard was laughter. Not the kind that made a room feel warm. The other kind. The kind that had edges. Harold Briggs was standing in front of the general store with his hat pushed back and his thumbs in his belt loops, and he was laughing loud enough that people 3 storefronts down turned to look. He hadn't even let her put down her suitcase. He had taken one look at her, just one, and shaken his head like a man inspecting a horse he'd already decided wasn't worth the price. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "the letters didn't mention she was plain." The woman beside him, his sister Clara would later learn, pressed her lips together but didn't tell him to stop. Nobody told him to stop. Clara stood in the middle of that dusty street with her suitcase in her hand and the sun cutting down hard on the back of her neck, and she did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't, but her face went hot in a way she hadn't felt since she was 12 years old, and a teacher read her composition aloud to the class wrong, making it sound foolish on purpose. If you've ever stood in a place where every eye was on you and none of them were kind, you already know what that felt like. This is her story, and it doesn't end the way anyone in Red Hollow expected. If this kind of story moves you, subscribe to the channel and follow along to the very end. We have more stories coming that you won't want to miss. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Clara had rehearsed the meeting in her head so many times that the real thing felt like stepping into a play where someone had switched out all the actors without telling her. She had exchanged letters with Harold Briggs for nearly 4 months. His letters were careful and polite, nothing poetic but decent. He ran a dry goods store. He was a widower. He said he needed someone steady. Clara had written back honestly. She was 26, she had spent the last 3 years caring for her mother through a long illness. She had no fortune and no connections, but she worked hard and she meant what she said. He had written back, "That is exactly what I need." She had believed him. She had believed all 3 of them, actually, which was the part that embarrassed her most when she thought about it later. Not that one man had rejected her, but that she had placed her entire future in the hands of 3 strangers and treated their letters as something close to promises. The second man was named Douglas Fell. He ran a small farm at the edge of town, and Clara had written to him through the same arrangements. A woman in Abilene who matched settlers with potential matches, kept their letters, and charged a modest fee for the service. Douglas's letters were warmer than Harold's. He mentioned his dog by name. He described the way the light looked in the evenings when the wheat was high. Clara had liked him most, if she was honest with herself, because his letters made her feel like she was reading something true rather than an advertisement. Douglas met her at the edge of the wagon road, not the main street, and he had the decency to wait until they were out of earshot before he said what he said. "Miss Bennett." He took off his hat, which she appreciated. "I received a letter last week from my cousin in Nebraska. She's a widow. We've known each other a long time." He turned the hat in his hands. "I didn't know how to write to you and tell you before you'd already made the journey, and I'm sorry for that. I truly am." Clara looked at him. He had the grace to look ashamed, at least. That was something. "You're calling it off," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once. "Did your cousin know she was the replacement?" He put his hat back on and didn't answer, which was its own answer. She walked back to the wagon road and carried her suitcase the rest of the way into town. The third man, a rancher named Cal Peters, she hadn't even been able to speak to directly. His mother had intercepted her outside the feed store, a compact woman in a gray dress who looked Clara up and down the same way Harold had, except without the laughter. "My son asked me to speak to you," the woman said. She held a small envelope, which she extended. He didn't feel a meeting in person would be practical, given how things have developed. "That's the cost of your lodging for 2 nights and a train ticket back east." Clara looked at the envelope and did not take it. "What developed?" she asked. "That isn't your concern." "He was writing to me for 3 months, Clara said, keeping her voice level, though something in her chest had started a sound she didn't have a word for. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something worse than either, because it had no clear direction. "I believe his reasons are my concern." The woman didn't soften. "He's decided to marry a local girl. It was always a possibility. I'm sorry you came such a distance." She set the envelope on the lip of the water trough next to Clara, as though leaving coins for a service rendered, and walked away without looking back. Clara stood there with the envelope on the trough and her suitcase at her feet, and around her the whole ordinary life of Red Hollow continued without pause. A horse nickering, two men arguing about fence posts, a child running past with a stick, and she felt the surreal, terrible sensation of being completely invisible to a world that had just humiliated her. She counted her money that evening in the room she'd rented at the boarding house with the last of her own savings. Not Cal's money. She'd picked the envelope off the trough and pushed it through the mail slot of the feed store with her name and his written on it. She didn't want it. What she had was $14.30, and the brooch her mother had given her, which she could sell if it came to that. She had 3 days, maybe 4 if she ate small, before the money ran out. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and took out a sheet of paper and a pencil and wrote a list. Not of her sorrows, of her options. That was the thing people who'd only met Clara briefly often misread about her. They saw the quietness and the unassuming face, and they thought she was soft. Her mother had never made that mistake. Her mother used to say Clara was the kind of person who got calmer the worse things got, which was either a gift or a warning, depending on what kind of day it was. The list was short. She could take the train back east to Abilene and try to find work, but she had barely enough for the ticket and nothing waiting at the other end. She could ask at the boarding house if they needed help. She'd noticed the kitchen was managed by one woman who looked bone-tired. She could ask at the general store, though Harold Briggs's face rose in her mind and she put a small mark against that option. She could ask at the school if they needed a teacher, though she didn't have formal credentials and suspected Red Hollow wasn't large enough to pay one. She was on her second pass through the list, looking for anything she'd missed, when the landlady knocked and came in with a small tray, tea and a piece of bread she hadn't asked for. "You're the one they all said no to," the woman said. Not cruel, just direct. Her name was Mrs. Aldine Hatch, and she had the manner of someone who had long since run out of patience for softening things unnecessarily. "Yes," Clara said. "You planning to leave?" "I'm planning to figure that out." Mrs. Hatch set the tray down and looked at her with the evaluating look that Clara would come to recognize as the woman's natural expression. "There's a letter came for you this afternoon. Arrived before you did, actually. I was going to leave it at the post, but since you're here." She set an envelope on top of Clara's list and walked out. Clara looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in plain handwriting. Not elegant, but deliberate, like someone who'd learned to write late and took it seriously. She opened it. "Miss Bennett, I'm writing this before I know whether you'll find yourself in need of alternatives, because word travels fast in small towns, and I wanted to write before you made any other decisions. My name is Wyatt Mercer. I run a cattle ranch 4 miles north of Red Hollow. My wife died 14 months ago. I have 2 children, a daughter age 9 and a son age 11. I am not writing to propose marriage. I am writing to offer honest work and a place to live in exchange for help managing the household and helping with the children's education. The ranch is not prosperous at the moment. I want to be clear about that so you make an informed choice. If you are interested, come out to the Mercer Ranch tomorrow morning. If you're not, I won't trouble you again. Wyatt Mercer." Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and ate the bread and drank the tea. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the wagon that morning, the sound in her chest quieted down enough that she could think. She told herself she'd decide in the morning. She decided before she fell asleep. The road north was longer than 4 miles felt when you were walking it with a suitcase, and the morning was already warm by the time Clara came over the last low rise and saw the Mercer Ranch laid out below her. She stopped. She hadn't let herself picture it, specifically because she'd learned in the past 24 hours what happened when you let yourself picture things. But even without expectations, what she saw gave her a moment's pause. The house was large enough, a proper farmhouse, 2 stories, with a porch that had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. But the porch railing on the left side had a gap where 2 boards were missing, and one of the window shutters on the second floor hung at an angle that suggested the hinge had been broken for some time. The yard had the look of a place that had been maintained by habit for a long while and then abruptly stopped. Firewood stacked against the house, but the stack half collapsed, a garden bed dug and edged properly, but the plants gone scraggly and untended, tools laid against the fence instead of put away. It wasn't ruin. It was something sadder than ruin, actually. It was a place that had clearly been cared for and then lost the person who'd done the caring. She picked up her suitcase and walked down. Wyatt Mercer was splitting wood at the side of the house when she came around the corner, and he stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd pictured from the letter. The letter had felt like it came from a man who sat at a desk, and this man very much did not look like he sat at desks. He had the hands and the neck of someone who worked outside every day, and he was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read because it was carefully neutral, which itself told her something. "Miss Bennet," he said. Not a question. He must have recognized her the same way she'd recognized his name. Process of elimination. "Mr. Mercer." He set the axe against the splitting block. "You had any breakfast?" "Some." "Coming in then. Kids are inside." He didn't offer to take her suitcase. She noted that. It wasn't rudeness. It was the same directness as his letter, a kind of respect that didn't dress itself up as consideration. The kitchen was the first thing she saw, and it had clearly once been the center of the house. The table was big enough for 6, the stove was good iron, and had been maintained better than the porch, and there were herbs hanging to dry above the window that had dried so long they'd turned colorless. Whoever had put them there had known what they were doing. Nobody had replaced them. A girl was sitting at the table with a book open in front of her that she wasn't reading. She looked up when Clara came in, and Clara recognized immediately the look of a child who had decided not to get attached to anything new. The eyes a little too still, the hands too quiet in her lap. "That's Lucy," Wyatt said. "And Ethan's. I don't want her here." The voice came from the hallway. A boy appeared in the doorway, older looking than 11 for reasons that had nothing to do with his size, and he looked at Clara with the kind of direct hostility that only children and people who've stopped caring about consequences are capable of. "I told you I don't want her here." "Ethan," Wyatt's voice was flat. "She's just going to leave anyway. They all leave." Clara set her suitcase down by the door. She looked at Ethan steadily. He looked back at her with his jaw set. "Who left?" she asked. He blinked. He'd expected her to look away, or look to Wyatt, or say something soothing and dishonest. "What?" "You said they all leave. Who else left?" A pause. "My mother." "She didn't leave," Clara said, not unkindly. "That's not the same thing." The boy's jaw tightened further, but something shifted in his eyes. Not softening, not yet, but a slight recalibration. He'd been readying himself for a particular kind of argument, and she hadn't given him the one he'd prepared for. "I'm not here to take her place," Clara said. "I'm here because your father wrote me a letter and I need work, and you apparently need someone who can help around the house. That's the whole of it." Ethan looked at his father. Wyatt was watching Clara with that same carefully neutral expression. "Can you cook?" Lucy asked. Her voice was quiet, the voice of someone who had been practicing not being noticed. "Well enough," Clara said. "Mama made very good biscuits," Lucy said. It wasn't a challenge. It was just information, offered with the terrible earnestness of a 9-year-old who didn't yet know how to be indirect about the things that mattered. "I make decent biscuits," Clara said. "Not the same as hers. Different." Lucy considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Okay," she said, and looked back down at her book. Ethan made a sound that was not quite a word and went back down the hallway. A door closed, not slammed, which Clara counted, against all her better judgment, as a small victory. Wyatt looked at her. "That's pretty much how the mornings go." "I've had worse mornings," Clara said. "I heard about yesterday." "I'm sure you did." He didn't apologize for Red Hollow, which she appreciated. It wasn't his to apologize for. "The arrangement," he said, "room and board and fair wage for work. House needs a lot of attention. Kids need schooling, Lucy especially. Ethan resists, but he listens sometimes when he thinks he isn't. I don't expect you to—" He stopped, reorganized whatever he'd been about to say. "I'm not asking you to pretend this is a normal household." "It doesn't look like one," Clara said. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite pain. "No, it doesn't." "What time do you need breakfast on the table?" He told her. She asked about the pantry. He showed her. She put her suitcase in the small room off the kitchen that he said had been for a hired girl they'd had the first year. The girl had gone back to her family in the spring, and she hung her coat on the back of the door and tied her hair back and started work. The first week was the kind of difficult that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It accumulated. The pantry was not as bare as she'd feared, but it was badly organized. Things mixed together that shouldn't be. Staples running low that should have been replenished 2 weeks ago. A bin of flour that had gotten damp and needed to be picked through carefully before it was usable. Clara spent the first morning inventorying it, and the second morning reorganizing it, and the third morning starting a list of what needed to come from the store in town. The kitchen itself she cleaned methodically, not because it was filthy. It wasn't. Wyatt had kept the worst of it at bay, but because it had the layer of a place where the work had been done by someone who was maintaining rather than living. Clara scrubbed the stovetop until the iron showed its proper dark color. She found a crock of rendered lard under the counter that was still good and used it to season the big pan that had gone slightly rusty from disuse. Ethan watched all of this from the hallway with the focused attention of someone waiting to find a flaw. She let him watch. She didn't perform for him, and she didn't ignore him. She just worked. And when she needed something she couldn't reach, she asked him where it was because he knew the house better than she did, and that was the truth. He answered her the first time with clear reluctance, pointing at the top shelf where the larger mixing bowls were kept. The second time he came and got it down himself without being asked, which meant he'd heard the first request and anticipated the second, which meant he was smarter than he was letting on. She filed that away. Lucy was easier in some ways and harder in others. She had none of Ethan's open resistance. She was cooperative, quiet, eager to be helpful in the careful way of a child who had decided that being useful was the safest kind of invisible. But Clara watched her through those first days and felt a particular ache she didn't name because naming it felt like overstepping. The girl was shrinking herself, making herself smaller, tucking her wants away somewhere private so she wouldn't have to feel the disappointment when they weren't met. Clara didn't try to draw her out. Not yet. She just made sure that when Lucy was in the room, she was spoken to as a full person rather than an accessory to the scene. She asked what Lucy was reading and actually listened to the answer. When Lucy mentioned, almost accidentally, that she'd liked doing arithmetic before being the word that carried all the weight, Clara put a sheet of problems on the table the next morning without comment, not as a lesson, just as a thing to do, and didn't say anything when Lucy sat down and started working through them with visible satisfaction. Wyatt she barely spoke to that first week, which was fine. He was in and out before dawn, back for meals, gone again. He ate what she put in front of him without complaint and without excessive praise, which she preferred. Compliments from someone who felt obligated to give them had always made her uncomfortable. He occasionally left notes on the counter, things that needed attention, supplies he was going to get in town, brief functional communication that told her exactly what she needed to know and nothing more. On the fourth morning, she found a note that said, "Fence in the east pasture came down. Won't be back until late. Biscuits were good." She stood in the kitchen reading it twice, and then folded it up and put it in her pocket and went to get breakfast on for the children. The town, when she had to go to it, was its own exercise. She went on the sixth day to get the items from her list at the general store, and Harold Briggs was behind the counter. He looked at her with the startled expression of someone who'd expected her to be gone. "Miss Bennet," he said, and then couldn't find anything to follow it with. "Mr. Briggs," she said, and gave him her list. He read it twice, more slowly than necessary, and started gathering things. While he was doing it, the door opened and two women came in, ranchers' wives, from their boots and the way they held themselves. And they both paused at the sight of Clara. She'd been braced for this. She'd braced herself the whole walk to town. What she hadn't braced for was what the older of the two women said. "You're the woman Wyatt Mercer hired," she said, not unkindly. "Yes, ma'am." The woman nodded. "How are those children?" "Not how are you, not what are you doing here. How are the children?" Clara looked at her and saw genuine concern and felt the complicated, slightly disorienting experience of being treated like she mattered because of the people she was connected to rather than who she was. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't nothing. "Lucy's settling," Clara said. "Ethan's working something out." The woman, Mrs. Caldwell, as Clara would learn, nodded like this was the most reasonable report she could have heard. "He's a hard one, that boy. Smart, though. Lord, he's smart. His mother always said she didn't know what to do with how smart he was." A pause, something gathering in her expression that she pressed down before it could surface. "Margaret was a good woman." "I'm sure she was," Clara said. She paid for her supplies, said goodbye to Mrs. Caldwell and her companion, and did not look at Harold Briggs on her way out. Walking back to the ranch with her basket, she let herself admit for the first time what she'd been keeping behind a closed door all week. She was not unhappy here. That was not the same as happy. But the specific misery she'd carried off the wagon a week ago, the hot shame of the street, the cold arithmetic of the boarding house, had loosened its grip, and in its place was something more like concentration. She had things to do. The things mattered. That was more than she'd had in a long time. She was not going to let herself think beyond that. Not yet. The breaking point, though it didn't look like one from the outside, happened on the 14th day. Ethan had been pushing her. Not dramatically. Not in ways that were easy to point at. He moved things she'd organized back to where they'd been before. He gave Lucy wrong answers to her arithmetic problems when he thought Clara wasn't listening, then looked at Clara sidelong to see if she'd caught it. He went silent at meals in a pointed architectural way, constructing his silence like a wall. Clara had let all of it go. She understood what he was doing. If he could make her fail, or lose her patience, or leave, it would confirm what he'd already decided. She wasn't going to confirm it. But the 14th day, she came into the kitchen to find that the crock she'd been soaking dried beans in overnight, 12 hours of her work toward dinner, had been emptied into the yard. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the empty crock. She heard Ethan in the hallway, not hiding, not pretending, just waiting. She put the crock back on the counter. She took her coat off the hook. She went out the back door and walked to the barn and stood inside it for approximately 2 minutes, in the dim and the smell of horses, and let herself feel the full unreasonable unfairness of it. Not just the beans, not just Ethan, all of it. The whole accumulation of the last 2 weeks and the week before that, and the 3 years of her mother's illness, and the long correspondence, and the wagon ride, and Harold Briggs's laughter on the main street of Red Hollow. Then she blew out a breath. She went back inside. Ethan was sitting at the table now, which was different. Usually he conducted his watching from the hallway. I was at the table with a piece of wood in his hand and a small knife, working at it with the focused, practiced movements of someone who'd been doing it a long time. She noticed his hands were good at it, more than good. "What are you making?" she asked. Silence. "Those are careful cuts," she said. "Someone taught you." He didn't answer that either, but his hand stilled briefly. "I'm going to start dinner from something else," Clara said. "I won't say anything about the beans to your father, but I need you to understand that what you're doing costs something, and it's not just me who pays it. Your sister eats dinner too." She went to the pantry. Behind her, after a long pause, Ethan said, "My mother taught me." Clara didn't turn around. She didn't make anything of it. "She had good hands then," she said, and started pulling out what she'd need. She heard him pick up the knife again. She heard the soft, careful sound of it against the wood. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not resolved, not anything you could put in a letter and make sound like a turning point. But she felt something in the room shift by some small degree, and she held on to it through the rest of the day like a coin in a pocket, something small and solid to press her thumb against when she needed to remember there was something worth the effort. By evening, she had a pot of salt pork and cornmeal on the stove that smelled better than it had any right to, given what she'd had to work with. And when Wyatt came in from the east pasture with mud to his knees and sat down at the table, he looked at the bowl in front of him and then looked at her with an expression that had more in it than she was prepared for. "I used to cook this," he said. "Couldn't get it to come out right." "What were you doing to it?" "Not enough salt, probably." "Probably," she agreed. Lucy asked for a second helping. Ethan ate his without comment, but he ate all of it, and he'd brought the piece of carved wood to the table in his lap, and once, when he thought no one was watching, he ran his thumb along the edge of it, the way you touch something that matters. Clara watched him do it and didn't let herself read too much into it, but she thought about what his mother had taught him and the careful cuts, and she made a note to herself about who this boy was underneath the armor. Not because she intended to dismantle the armor, but because if you wanted to understand a person, you had to start with what they protected. Outside, the sun was going down over Red Hollow and the land beyond it, and the light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in a wide stripe of gold. And for a moment the four of them, a man carrying grief like a stone in his chest, 2 children managing loss in entirely opposite ways, and a woman who had arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a penciled list, were just people sitting down together at the end of a day. It wasn't much. It was something. The small carved piece of wood stayed on the kitchen windowsill after that. Ethan hadn't put it there deliberately, or if he had, he'd done it in that sideways manner of his, setting it down while pretending he was reaching for something else, and then walking out of the room before anyone could comment. But it was there the next morning when Clara came down to start the stove, a rough-cut bird maybe 3 inches long with its wings folded, and she left it exactly where it was and didn't mention it to anyone. Some things you left alone. She was learning which ones. The third week settled into something that wasn't yet routine, but was beginning to have the shape of one. Clara was up before the children, stove lit, water on, whatever was going to take time started first. Wyatt was usually already gone. She heard him in the barn before first light sometimes. The low sound of him talking to the horses the way some men talk to horses, quietly and without self-consciousness. He came in for breakfast, ate, spoke briefly about what the day needed, and left again. The evenings were longer. He stayed at the table after the children went to bed sometimes, drinking coffee that had gone too strong because nobody had remembered to pull it, and Clara worked at the other end of the table mending or going over what Lucy had done in the way of lessons that day, and they existed in the same room without requiring anything of each other. She hadn't expected to find that comfortable. She did. The town of Red Hollow had its own rhythm with her, which was complicated and not fully settled. Mrs. Caldwell had taken it upon herself to speak well of Clara to whoever she happened to be speaking to, which Clara was grateful for in the way you're grateful for an umbrella. Someone loans you, appreciative of the gesture while being aware that you'd rather not need it. The whispers hadn't stopped. She caught them at the edges of conversations when she came in for supplies, the particular way voices lowered when she walked past the post office, the way certain women looked at her and then looked at each other with that small economy of expression that carried whole paragraphs. The woman all 3 men turned away, the one Wyatt Mercer took in out of pity. She could hear the version of her that existed in other people's mouths, and it bore only a passing resemblance to the person she actually was. She'd decided in the second week that she was not going to make fixing that her project. People would think what they thought. She had enough actual work in front of her, and there was plenty of it. The household had been running on the bare minimum for over a year. Laundry done, but not properly dried, so things went slightly musty. Floors swept, but not scrubbed. Meals functional, but not planned ahead, which meant they were always one bad day from running out of something essential. Clara worked her way through it methodically. Not all at once. She'd learned from watching her mother's illness that trying to fix everything at once was how you broke yourself. But steadily, one thing at a time, so that each week the house was marginally better than the week before, in a way that was hard to point at, but accumulated into something you could feel. Wyatt noticed. He didn't say so directly, but she caught him sometimes looking at something she'd fixed or organized with an expression that was hard to read precisely because he was trying hard not to let it be readable. Once she found him standing in the doorway of the pantry just looking at the shelves, which she'd reorganized with labeled crocks and the dry goods in proper order. And when he heard her behind him, he stepped back immediately like he'd been caught doing something embarrassing. "Sorry," he said. He stopped. "It's your pantry," Clara said. "Margaret had it organized like this," he said, and then looked like he wished he hadn't. Clara waited. "Not exactly like this," he said, correcting himself, which she understood was important to him. "Different. But she had a system." "Most people who cook a lot do," Clara said, and went past him to get what she needed. She heard him stand there another moment and then walk away. And she didn't read anything into it except that he was a man trying to live in a house that was full of the shape of someone who wasn't there anymore. And that was its own kind of work she couldn't help him with directly. Lucy, by the 4th week, had started doing something that Clara only recognized slowly for what it was. She had begun talking during lessons. Not just answering questions, talking, the way children talked when they felt safe enough to let their thoughts wander into the room. She'd be working through a reading problem and then look up and say something like, "The woman in this story is very stupid. She should have just asked," and then look back down like she hadn't said anything. Clara learned to respond to these asides without making them into occasions, just answering as though the conversation was already in progress, because the moment you made a big thing of Lucy talking was the moment she stopped. The arithmetic was easy. Lucy had a natural feel for numbers that Clara recognized because she'd had it herself at that age. The way some children saw the logic in figures as though it were obvious, as though the relationships between numbers made a kind of sense, that words often didn't. Within 2 weeks, she was doing work that was 2 grades past where she should have been, and Clara let her run with it because there was no good reason not to. Ethan was harder. He had stopped emptying crocks and moving things around, but he'd replaced active resistance with something more passive and in some ways more difficult, a kind of careful absence. I was present at meals, he answered direct questions, he did his chores without being told twice. But he held himself at a remove that was precise and deliberate, and when Clara tried to engage him on anything beyond the functional, he had a way of going very still and waiting until the moment passed. She kept finding edges of him, though, without trying to. He was reading things he didn't want her to know he was reading. She found a book on surveying tucked under his mattress when she changed the linens. Not hidden exactly, but not left out either. He had an almost compulsive neatness about certain things. His boots were always by the door in the same position, his knife always cleaned and put away, his carving pieces arranged on the shelf in his room in a particular order she'd glimpsed once through the open door. And he listened. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He would be across the room, apparently absorbed in something else, and later in the day or the next morning he would say something that could only have come from a conversation she'd had with someone else while he was there. He stored things. He held them and turned them over in private and let the ones that were useful come back out when he chose. She was careful not to let him see her noticing. She'd learned that much. The crisis, when it came, arrived from a direction she hadn't anticipated, not from inside the house at all. It was a man named Gideon Pratt. She first heard his name from Mrs. Caldwell, who mentioned him in the way people mentioned the weather, as a fact of the environment you simply had to account for. Pratt ran, a spread to the south and west of Red Hollow, considerably larger than Wyatt's, and he had been, by slow and quiet degrees, making the surrounding smaller ranchers uncomfortable. Nothing you could put your finger on cleanly. A fence line that moved 6 feet over the winter and nobody could say exactly when. A water agreement with the town that had been renegotiated in terms favorable to Pratt's land use. 2 families who had sold and left in the past year, and the general sense, which nobody stated directly, that the leaving had not been entirely voluntary. She heard this in pieces, from Mrs. Caldwell, and from the feed store owner, and from a ranch hand named Pete, who worked for Wyatt, and sometimes ate in the kitchen when a job kept him late. Pete was the kind of man who talked the way water ran. He'd go around obstacles rather than over them, and you had to follow the course of what he was saying to understand where it was actually going. But the shape of it, over several conversations, was clear enough. Pratt wanted the Mercer water rights. The creek that ran through the north end of Wyatt's land fed into the main water source for the whole valley's east side, and the rights to it had been in the Mercer family for 30 years. Without those rights, a significant portion of Pratt's planned expansion became either much harder or impossible. With them, it became easy. When Clara mentioned Pratt to Wyatt directly, she was not in the habit of going around things, which Wyatt had figured out by now. He went the way he went when something bothered him, which was quiet and then more quiet, with a particular set to his jaw that she'd learned meant the subject was real, even if he wasn't going to discuss it. "He's made an offer," he said, finally, "for the north section. Are you going to take it?" "No." "What does he do when people say—" Wyatt looked at her across the table. It was evening. The children were in bed. The lamp between them was burning low on oil she needed to refill. He had a look on his face that was not quite surprise but was close to it. The look of a man not accustomed to being asked direct questions by someone sitting in his own kitchen. "He's patient," Wyatt said. "He waits for things to get harder. And things are getting harder." It wasn't a question. She'd been watching the books. Wyatt didn't ask her to, but they were on the desk in the front room, and she was not the kind of person who let an unexamined set of figures sit in the same house as her. The ranch was not failing, but it was not recovering the way it should have been. The herd was smaller than 2 years ago. There had been medical expenses the previous winter. The equipment needed work that hadn't happened. "The ranch was in better shape when Margaret was alive," Wyatt said. He said it flatly, without self-pity, which made it harder to hear than if he'd said it with feeling. "She managed the accounts. I was better on the land side." "You can be better on the account side," Clara said. "It's not complicated. It's just time." "I don't have a lot of that." "I do," she said. He looked at her. "That's not what I'm paying you for. You're paying me to keep the house and help with the children. The house includes the part of it that has a desk and a ledger in it, as far as I'm concerned." A pause. You know accounts? My mother was a seamstress with 4 regular clients and a habit of trading services for goods that she needed to track carefully. I learned how to keep a ledger at about the same age Lucy's learning arithmetic. Wyatt looked at the table. I'd want to know what you find. I'll tell you everything. He was quiet for another moment, and she could see him working something out, not the logic of the offer, which was obvious, but the part underneath it, the part that was about what it meant to let someone else that far into what was his and Margaret's. All right, he said. She started the next morning. What she found in the ledger was not catastrophic and was not good. There were debts that were being managed but not reduced, a pattern of paying what was most urgent rather than what was most expensive, which meant the interest was eating more than it should. There were 2 contracts with buyers in Abilene that had been written in terms more favorable to the buyer than they needed to be. Not fraudulent, just the terms of someone who hadn't been sure enough of his position to negotiate harder. And there was a recurring expense she didn't recognize, listed only as an initial, P, showing up quarterly at a fixed amount. She brought it to Wyatt that evening. What is P? She asked, and set the ledger in front of him with her finger on the line. He looked at it a long time without answering. Pete was in the kitchen that night, having come in late after a fence repair, eating at the end of the table with his hat off. He looked up at the silence. That's Pratt, Pete said, without being asked. Wyatt looked at Pete with an expression that said he'd have preferred Pete not to say that, but Pete had the impenetrable calm of a man who'd said what was true and saw no reason to take it back. Pratt, Clara repeated. He made a loan, Wyatt said. Last spring, when we had the losses. Secured against what? Another silence. This one was longer. Part of the north section, Wyatt said. Clara kept her face still. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the quarterly amounts, which were larger than they looked when you saw them individually, and added them up, and felt the architecture of the thing take shape. Pratt had not waited for things to get hard, or not only that. He had helped make them hard, or helped ensure that when they got hard, there was a door already open with his name on it. How long do you have before the note comes due? She asked. 8 months, Wyatt said, give or take. And if you can't pay it? He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Pete put down his fork. Man's got a long game, he said, which was the most Pete had ever said about anything in Clara's hearing, and the weight of it lay across the table for a moment before Wyatt picked up the ledger and closed it. I'll deal with it, he said. How? Clara asked. I don't know yet. She didn't push. She understood the difference between the moment to push and the moment to let a man sit with a thing. She took the ledger back and went over it again after he'd gone to bed, making her own notes in the margins in pencil. Figures that could be recovered, the contracts that could be renegotiated, the difference between what was owed and what could realistically be cleared in 8 months if the cattle prices held. It was not impossible. That was the thing she kept coming back to. It was not good, but it was not impossible, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered enormously, and that Wyatt, in his particular combination of pride and grief and exhaustion, might not be able to see clearly right now. She fell asleep at the table and woke up with her cheek on the ledger and the lamp guttered out and the kitchen cold, and she sat up in the dark and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and reminded herself that this was not her problem to fix, except that it was, increasingly, the problem she was inside of. That was what happened when you stayed somewhere. The walls stopped being someone else's walls. She went to bed and didn't sleep well, and was up before the stove had properly caught, standing in the kitchen in the pre-dawn gray thinking about 8 months and a note secured against land that Wyatt's family had held for 30 years. And she was still thinking about it when Lucy came downstairs in her nightgown, hair tangled, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. You're up early, Lucy said. Couldn't sleep. Lucy came and climbed up on the kitchen chair and folded her hands on the table the way she sometimes did when she was about to say something she'd been working up to. Are we going to lose the ranch? She asked. Clara looked at her. Where did you hear that? Ethan said. Clara made a note to talk to Ethan about what he said in front of his sister, though she suspected Ethan had said it precisely because he'd known Lucy was listening, which was its own kind of thing to deal with. Your father is working on it, Clara said. Are you helping him? I'm doing what I can. Lucy looked at her with those two still eyes that could sometimes see more than a 9-year-old was supposed to see. Ethan doesn't want to move, she said. He doesn't say so, but I can tell. Mama is here. The word landed the way it always did when it came out of Lucy. Not like a knife, just like a stone dropped from height, heavy and true. I know, Clara said. I don't want to move either, Lucy said. Then, do you? Clara looked at her. It was a question she hadn't let herself consider directly, which told her something about how far along she'd gotten without noticing. No, she said, and was surprised to find how completely she meant it. Lucy seemed to find this satisfying. She unfolded her hands and slid off the chair. I'll set the table, she said, and went to get the plates. The thing that happened with Pratt happened on a Tuesday. He came to the ranch in the middle of the morning, which Clara understood was deliberate. Middle of the day, Wyatt on the far pasture, ranch hand out with the herd, no audience but the house. He came in a good wagon with a good horse, and a man beside him who sat with the specific stillness of someone paid to be present as a reminder of something. Clara was on the porch when the wagon came down the track. She'd been beating dust out of a rug, and she'd stopped doing that, but she didn't put the beater down. Pratt was a man in his 50s with a broad, pleasant face that had learned to carry his intelligence somewhere behind the pleasant, so that you had to look for it. He tipped his hat. Morning, ma'am. Wyatt Mercer around. He's out on the land, Clara said. I can tell him you called. I'll wait, Pratt said, with the easy confidence of a man who was used to determining how long he'd stay in a place. It could be a while, Clara said. That's fine. He looked at the house with a look she recognized. The look of a man calculating what something was worth and already starting to imagine what he'd do with it. Nice property, he said. Mercer family always kept it up well. Mr. Mercer keeps it up well, Clara said. Pratt looked at her with a slight recalibration of interest, the way you looked at a door that had pushed back when you tried to open it. You're the woman he hired, he said. I work here, yes. Long way from wherever you started, he said pleasantly. Not so far, Clara said. He stayed another beat, reading her, and she looked back at him steadily and didn't offer anything else. The man beside him in the wagon hadn't moved. You might let him know, Pratt said, that the offer I made on the north section is still open. I'd hate for a good family to end up in a difficult position over a piece of land when there's an easy path available. I'll let him know you said so, Clara said. He tipped his hat again, said good day, and turned the wagon around and drove back up the track. Clara stood on the porch and watched until they were out of sight, and then went inside and wrote down everything he'd said, and the time he'd come, and the description of the man with him, because she had learned from the ledger that Pratt was not a man who left things to chance, and she had a feeling that documentation was going to matter before this was over. When Wyatt came in that evening, she told him. He listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was what he did when something actually concerned him. The less he interrupted, the more serious it was. He came here, Wyatt said. Yes. He's never come to the ranch before. I didn't think so. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the house. Yes. He pushed back from the table and stood up and went to the window, which was not something he usually did. He was not a pacer, not a man who moved to think. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she let him stand. My father built that house, he said. I know. Margaret chose every piece of wood in that floor. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. Ethan, probably, not asleep. You said 8 months, Wyatt said, give or take, depending on how he counts. What would you do? He asked. If it were yours. She thought about it seriously, because he'd asked seriously. I'd start with the Abilene contracts, she said. The terms aren't right. You should be getting more per head. If you can renegotiate before the fall drive, the difference over the rest of the year starts to close the gap. She paused. And I'd find out exactly what that note says. The actual document. Not what you remember of it. What it says. He turned around. You think he'll try something before it's due. I think a patient man who comes to look at a house in the middle of a Tuesday morning when everyone's on the land isn't waiting for anything to happen naturally, Clara said. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him doing what she'd seen him do before, not with her specifically, but with things in general. The mental accounting of how much to trust something, how far to let it in. She'd watched him do it with the decision to write her a letter. She'd watched him do it the first morning when she'd walked down that rise with her suitcase. I'll find the note, he said. Tonight. I'll look it over, she said, if you want. He nodded once and went upstairs to look for it, and Clara sat at the kitchen table and pulled the ledger back toward her and thought about Pratt's face when she'd looked back at him on the porch. That slight recalibration of interest. And she understood that whatever he'd expected to find at the Mercer Ranch, it hadn't been her. That was something. She was going to have to figure out how to make it count. The note was worse than Wyatt had remembered, which was not unusual. People who were desperate when they signed things tended to remember what they'd needed to believe was there rather than what was actually written. The clause Pratt had included about the right of early collection under specific conditions of default was written in language that sounded standard and wasn't. And it took Clara 3 careful readings, and Pete, who it turned out had done some legal clerking before he'd turned to ranch work, confirming her reading before she was sure enough to say it plainly. He can call the note early, she told Wyatt, under the right conditions, or what he decides are the right conditions. Wyatt sat very still. Which means 8 months might not be 8 months, Clara said. It might be whenever he decides he wants it to be 8 months from. The lamp between them was the only light in the kitchen. Lucy and Ethan were long in bed. Pete was at the other end of the table, not part of the conversation, but not pretending he wasn't hearing it either. "Can he do that?" Wyatt asked. "Not to her exactly, to the room." "He wrote it into the note," Pete said. "And you signed it." Wyatt's jaw worked. Clara could see what it was costing him to sit with that. Not just the practical fact of it, but the specific shame of having signed something he hadn't understood fully, during a time when he'd been barely functional with grief and loss and a ranch that needed more of him than he'd had to give. "This isn't your fault," Clara said, which she'd told herself she wasn't going to say because she didn't generally say things like that. But she said it because it was true. And because the truth was sometimes what a room needed most. "Doesn't change what's in the document," he said. "No, but knowing it isn't your fault means you can stop spending energy on that and spend it on what to do instead." He looked at her. "What would you do?" he said again. Same question as before. She understood it differently this time, so it wasn't really about the ranch. "I'd find a lawyer," she said, "before Pratt does anything. I'd make sure every piece of paper on this property is in order and that you understand exactly what you own and what you owe and what the conditions are. And I'd start those conversations with the Abilene buyers tomorrow." "I don't know any lawyers." "Mrs. Caldwell might," Clara said. "She seems to know most things." Something moved across his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the suggestion of one. The shape a face makes before it decides whether to commit to one. "She does," he said. "Then that's tomorrow," Clara said, and closed the ledger. Pete drained his coffee. "She's not wrong," he said, to no one in particular. Clara put the ledger on the desk and came back and blew out the lamp. And in the dark, the kitchen settled around them. The sound of the house, the far sound of cattle, the ordinary sounds of a place that was worth fighting for. She went to bed, and this time she slept, though she lay awake long enough to hear Wyatt in the room above hers, not pacing, but not still, moving the way you moved when your mind wouldn't settle, back and forth across a floor that someone you loved had chosen the wood for, in a house your father had built, on land your family had held for 30 years. She stared at the ceiling and thought, 8 months or less, and a man with a patient face and a note that said what he needed it to say. And then she thought about Lucy saying, "I don't want to move either," with her hands folded on the table, and Ethan's carved bird on the windowsill, and Margaret's herbs gone colorless above the window, and she thought about what it meant to belong to a place before the place had decided it belonged to you. She closed her eyes. There was work to do in the morning. Mrs. Caldwell did know a lawyer. His name was Robert Hale, and he practiced out of a single office above the saddle shop in Red Hollow, with a desk that was buried under papers and a manner that was dry enough to cure leather. He was 60-something, had bad knees, and had apparently spent 15 years in a larger city before returning to the county where he'd grown up for reasons he didn't volunteer and nobody asked about. Mrs. Caldwell described him as the most honest man in Red Hollow, which in context meant he was honest enough that some people actively disliked him for it. Wyatt went to see him on a Wednesday. Clara stayed at the ranch with the children and spent the morning trying not to count the hours, which she was not entirely successful at. He came back in the late afternoon and came straight to the kitchen, which was where she was, and sat down at the table with his hat in his hands. "Hale, read the note," he said. "And?" He said, "It's real. The clause is real." He turned his hat by the brim. He also said it's not the first time he's seen a note written that way. He said Pratt has used the same language with 2 other ranchers in the county in the past 3 years. Clara sat down across from him. Did they lose their land? One did. One paid him off before it got to that. Did Hale keep records of the other notes? Wyatt looked up. I don't know. I didn't ask. Go back and ask, Clara said. If he's using the same language, the same structure with multiple people, that's a pattern. That's the kind of thing a pattern can be useful. He looked at her for a moment. You think there's a case? I think there might be the beginning of one. I'm not a lawyer, but I know that 1 document is a transaction and 3 documents with identical language starts to look like a practice. And practices can be scrutinized in ways single transactions can't. He was quiet. Outside, Pete was crossing the yard toward the barn, and the ordinary sound of it, boots on dry ground, the barn door, was strangely grounding. Hale also said, Wyatt continued, that the Abilene contracts are as bad as you thought. He knows a buyer out of Wichita who works differently. Better terms, more reliable, not as large a volume, but consistent, Clara said. Yes, consistent is worth more than large right now. He nodded. He was still turning the hat. She watched his hands and thought about what it cost a man like Wyatt to walk into a lawyer's office and lay out the evidence of his own mistakes and hear them confirmed. And she felt something for him she didn't have a clean name for. Not pity, which would have been wrong, but a kind of recognition. She had done her own version of it when she sat in a boarding house and counted $14.30 and made herself look at the list of what was actually in front of her, rather than what she'd imagined would be. Hale wants a retainer, Wyatt said. I don't have it. How much? He told her. She thought about it. I have some saved, she said. Not all of it, but enough for half. If you can get the other half. Clara, it's a loan, she said before he could argue. You pay me back when the ranch is in better shape. I'll write it down so we both have it clear. Why would you? He stopped, started again. You've got no guarantee I can pay it back. You're not Gideon Pratt, she said. That's a better guarantee than a clause in a note. He looked at her across the table with an expression she'd seen before on his face, but not quite like this. Not the carefully neutral look and not the closed-off look, but something more unguarded than either. He looked for a moment like a man who didn't know what to do with what was in front of him. All right, he said finally. The retainer was paid by the end of the week. Hale began quietly making inquiries about the other notes. Wyatt wrote to the Wichita buyer. Clara wrote it all down in a separate ledger she'd bought with her own money from the general store. Not Harold Briggs's store, the other one. The smaller one run by a woman named Tess Garland, who asked no questions and charged fair prices. The work settled into the same shape as everything else. Daily, unglamorous, and necessary. What she hadn't accounted for was Lucy getting sick. It came on fast, the way fevers did with children, which was one of the things Clara had learned during her mother's long illness. That adult illness announced itself gradually and gave you time to prepare, and children's illness arrived like weather, with almost no warning and then all at once. On a Thursday evening, Lucy was quieter than usual at dinner, which Clara noticed but attributed to tiredness. By the time she checked on her before bed, the girl was burning. Clara put her hand on Lucy's forehead and felt the heat of it and said calmly, "All right," which was what she said to herself when something required her to move past the first feeling and into the next thing. She went to get Wyatt. He was in the barn finishing something with a piece of harness, and he came in immediately when she told him, and the look on his face when he put his own hand on Lucy's forehead was the look of a man for whom this specific fear had its own particular shape. He'd watched his wife go in bed with a fever that had come on fast. He'd sat in this house and watched it happen and not been able to do anything and lost her anyway. And the look on his face now was not just a father's fear. It was a man reaching the edge of something he'd stood at before and fallen from. "I need you to go get the doctor," Clara said. "Haggerty's in Millfield. That's 3 hours." "I know. Go." "I can't leave her." "I'll be here," Clara said. "I know what to do. I need you to go get Haggerty, and I need you to do it now while there's still enough light." He looked at Lucy, small and too still in the bed, and then at Clara, and something in him made the decision the way you made decisions in emergencies. Not on confidence exactly, but on the absence of better options and the presence of someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. He went. She heard the horse go out of the yard at a pace Wyatt didn't usually push, and then the house was quiet except for Lucy's breathing, which was too fast and too shallow, and the sound of Ethan in the doorway behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She was already checking Lucy's temperature again by feel. Too high, high enough to worry about, not yet at the level where she'd seen things go wrong. But the night was ahead of them, and fevers in children had their own schedule that had nothing to do with what you wanted. "How bad is it?" Ethan said. His voice was different from the voice he used during the day, flatter, younger, stripped of the architecture he'd built around himself. "Hi," Clara said. "I've seen worse, but we're going to work tonight." "You've seen this before." "My mother was sick for a long time. I learned." She finally turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway in his nightshirt, arms crossed over his chest, and he looked about 9 years old, which was something that happened to 11-year-olds when they were frightened enough to forget to be older. "I need your help," she said. His chin came up slightly. "What do you need?" "Water from the well, cool as it comes. The big basin from the pantry. And I need you to find me the willow bark. There should be some in the tin on the second shelf. It's labeled, 'Your Mother's Writing.'" His jaw tightened at that. She watched him absorb it. "Go," she said, not unkindly. He went. She turned back to Lucy and worked quickly and quietly, got the top blanket off her, loosened her nightgown, began the process of trying to bring the heat down the way her mother's doctor had shown her years ago in a different house in a different life. Cool cloths on the forehead, the back of the neck, the wrists. Not cold, cool. You didn't want to shock the body, you wanted to reason with it, or that was how she'd always thought of it, as though the body were something you could talk into cooperating if you used the right tone. Ethan came back with the basin and the water and found the tin on the second shelf without having to look twice, which meant he knew exactly where everything in that pantry was, probably could find it blind. She set the willow bark to steep in the small pot she'd asked him to heat, because if she could get Lucy to take some of it when she was less fevered, it would help with the worst of the pain and the heat. "Now what?" Ethan said. "Pull the chair up and sit on that side. When I change the cloth, you rinse the used one and wring it out. Your hands are quicker than mine at the wringing, probably." He pulled the chair up and sat and did what she described, and they worked in that way for a time without speaking. Clara at one side of the bed, Ethan at the other, and Lucy between them pulling shallow, quick breaths. "She doesn't look right," Ethan said. "No." "What do we do if it gets worse?" "We keep doing this," Clara said. "We don't stop." He looked at his sister's face. In the lamplight, he looked older again, the 9-year-old retreating, the 11-year-old coming back but with something different in it. The specific gravity of someone who had decided to be present for something rather than protected from it. "She was sick once before," he said, "after Mama died. She got a fever then, too." He rinsed the cloth and wrung it carefully. "Papa didn't sleep for 2 days. "What broke it?" Clara asked. "I don't know. It just broke." He handed her the cloth. "She cried for Mama the whole time, even when she was asleep." Clara put the cloth on Lucy's forehead. "She's not asking for her now," Clara said quietly. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I noticed," he said. "The first hour was the hardest because the fever climbed before it plateaued, which was what fevers did and which she'd known to expect, but which was still difficult to manage through when the person climbing the fever was 9 years old and weighed less than a sack of grain and kept turning her head like she was looking for something." Clara talked to Lucy through it. Not words that made a story, just quiet sound, voice without content, the way you talk to a restless animal or someone almost asleep. She'd done it with her mother. She didn't know if it helped the fever, but she believed it helped the person having it, and in the absence of the doctor, that was what she had. Ethan watched her do it. He didn't comment. He kept rinsing cloths and handing them over with a steady efficiency that she would have admired in anyone and found, in him, genuinely moving. This boy who had spent weeks trying to drive her out of the house was now sitting at his sister's bedside in the middle of the night doing exactly what was asked of him. No more argument, no more walls, just the simple stripped-down competence of someone who had decided this was the thing that mattered. Around midnight, Lucy's temperature peaked. Clara knew because she'd been taking it every 20 minutes with the glass thermometer she'd found in a tin in the medicine cabinet. More of Margaret's careful organization. Everything labeled, everything where it should be. A woman who had managed this household the way Clara was beginning to understand she'd managed everything, with a kind of patient thoroughness that had its own beauty. The peak was high, high enough that Clara felt the first edge of real fear, the kind that had teeth, the kind she couldn't reason away with experience or technique. She didn't let Ethan see it. She adjusted the cloth on Lucy's forehead and thought about the doctor 3 hours away on a dark road and about Wyatt's face when he'd left the yard, and she said to herself, the way she had in the barn on the day of the beans, the same quiet internal instruction. Not yet. Talk to her, Clara said to Ethan. What? Talk to her. Tell her something. It doesn't matter what. He hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet Clara could barely hear it, he started talking about the bird he was carving, the wings, why he'd shaped them folded instead of open, how their mother had always said the most interesting moment in a bird's life wasn't flight, but the instant before it, the coiled potential of a thing deciding whether to go. He talked about it steadily, quietly, and Clara worked on the other side of the bed and felt the room hold itself around what he was saying. Lucy's breathing changed at some point in the next half hour. Slower, deeper. Still not right, but different. The quality of something that was working through a thing rather than fighting it. The fever broke at just past 2 in the morning. Clara felt it in the cloth when she pressed it to Lucy's neck. The skin suddenly itself again, warm in the ordinary way, the terrible dry radiating heat gone. She held her hand there for a long moment to be sure, and then she sat back in her chair and let out a breath that she'd been holding in pieces for 6 hours. Ethan was looking at her. It broke, she said. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. His shoulders shook once, twice, not crying, or not what crying looked like in a boy who'd taught himself not to, something more internal, a release of pressure that had nowhere to go. Clara let it be what it was, and didn't name it, and didn't reach for him. After a moment he straightened up. His eyes were dry. She's going to be all right? She needs rest and water and watching for the next day, but yes, I think so. He looked at Lucy, who had turned onto her side in the bed the way people did when the worst of a fever broke, reorganizing themselves, returning to something like ordinary sleep. He looked at her for a long time with an expression Clara recognized from the first day she'd arrived, from the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen with that flat, prepared hostility, and she saw that the expression had the same intensity, but a completely different quality now, like the same amount of force directed somewhere true instead of somewhere defensive. I thought she was going to... He stopped. I know, Clara said. I thought I was going to lose her too. She didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything to say to it that wasn't smaller than the thing he'd said. After a moment, he stood up and went and stood at the window and looked out at the dark yard, and Clara refilled the basin and set it close to the bed for when Lucy woke thirsty, which she would. You weren't scared, Ethan said, still at the window. I was, Clara said. I was scared the whole time. He turned around. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the bird on the windowsill, like something that had turned out to be different from what he'd expected, and he wasn't sure yet what to do with that. You didn't act scared, he said. Being scared and stopping working are two different things, Clara said. He considered this with the same focused attention he gave everything that actually interested him. Is that something you learned? From my mother, she said. She was sick for a long time. She was scared most of it. She still made dinner, and she still asked about my day, and she still did the accounts. Ethan was quiet. Then, my mother did that too. I know, Clara said. I can tell by how this house was built. He looked at her. Not challenging, not testing. Something more open than either. She would have liked you, he said, and it clearly cost him something to say it, and he clearly said it anyway because it was true. And he was, underneath all of it, a boy who respected the truth. Clara felt something move through her that she was not going to put a name to, sitting in a sick room at 2 in the morning with a 9-year-old asleep between them. That means something to me, she said, simply and honestly. He nodded. He went back to his chair and picked up the cloth and rinsed it out again, even though it wasn't needed yet, because he needed something to do with his hands, and Clara understood that completely. Wyatt arrived with Dr. Haggerty at 4:15 in the morning. Clara heard the horses in the yard and went to the top of the stairs so he could see her face before he saw anything else, and know that the news was what he needed it to be. She watched his face when he saw her. The way it changed, the way something he'd been braced against for 6 hours came loose. He took the stairs two at a time. Dr. Haggerty, who was 70 if he was a day, and had the unhurried manner of someone who had seen everything at least twice, came up behind him and examined Lucy with quiet thoroughness, while Wyatt stood at the foot of the bed with his hat in his hands again, unable to put himself anywhere else. "Fever broke," Haggerty said, to the room in general. "When?" "Just past 2, Clara said. "What did you do?" She told him. He listened with his eyes on Lucy, nodding occasionally. "Textbook," he said, which was not how she'd have described it. There had been nothing textbook about any of the past 6 hours. But she understood he meant she'd done it right, and she accepted that. He looked at Ethan, who had not gone back to his room and apparently had no intention of it. "You help her?" Ethan straightened in his chair. "Yes, sir." "Good," Haggerty said, and closed his bag. He spoke to Wyatt in the hallway. Clara heard it, most of it, the ordinary instructions of a doctor who'd been called too late to do the work and was reviewing what someone else had done. She heard him say she knew what she was doing, and she heard Wyatt say something too quiet to make out, and then footsteps on the stairs. She was changing the cloth on Lucy's forehead when Wyatt came back into the room. He stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter and looked at his son in the chair and looked at Clara. He looked like a man who had ridden hard for 6 hours and aged 10 years and come home to something he'd been terrified he was going to lose and found it still there. "Thank you," he said. Clara wrung out the cloth. "She did the hard part," she said. "Clara." He said her name the way people said a name when they wanted to stop you from deflecting. She looked up. His face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, all the careful neutrality gone, everything that was underneath it showing, the grief and the relief, and something else that was newer than either. "Thank you," he said again, just that. She held his gaze for a moment. "Go sit with her," she said. "I'll get coffee on." She went downstairs and put the kettle on and stood in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light and listened to the house around her. The doctor's heavy footsteps on the porch, the horse in the yard, Wyatt's voice upstairs saying something to Ethan, and then Ethan's voice responding, and then Lucy's voice, thin and tired and real. She was alive. She was talking. The fever was gone. Clara pressed her palm flat against the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment in the quiet and let herself feel the full length of the night. Not the fear, she was done with that, but the specific physical weight of having held something that mattered through the hours when it could have gone differently. She made the coffee. She made it strong. When Dr. Haggerty came through the kitchen on his way out, he stopped and accepted a cup without being asked, which told her he was a man who recognized when coffee was available to him and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. He drank half of it standing at the counter, looking at nothing in particular. Then he said, "Where'd you learn to manage a fever like that?" "My mother was ill for 3 years, Clara said. "Her doctor showed me a lot." "You kept your head." "I tried to." He looked at her with the direct, unglamorous assessment of someone whose whole professional life had been looking at things plainly. "These kids need that," he said. "Someone who keeps their head." He finished the coffee and set the cup down and picked up his bag. At the door he paused. "The girl's going to need a week of rest and light food. She'll fight you on the light food." "I won't," Clara said. He left. The sun was beginning to come up over the eastern ridge, the particular pale gold of a morning that had been earned rather than arrived at, and Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it for a moment before she went back to work. She was taking Lucy's temperature for the 6th time that morning when she noticed Ethan had finally fallen asleep in the chair, sideways, head tilted at an angle that was going to hurt when he woke up, one hand dropped open on the armrest. He'd stayed all night. He'd helped all night. And he'd fallen asleep in his sister's room because he hadn't been willing to go to his own, which told Clara everything she needed to know about who he was under the weeks of walls and careful resistance. She found a blanket from the linen chest in the hallway and laid it over him without waking him. He didn't stir. He was, finally, just a tired 11-year-old who had done something hard and hadn't been beaten by it, and she let him sleep. Wyatt was sitting on the edge of Lucy's bed, his back to the door. He'd taken his boots off at some point, which for some reason made him look more human than almost anything she'd seen. He had his daughter's hand in both of his, and he was looking at her the way parents looked at sleeping children when they'd been reminded of what it would mean to lose them. Clara left them and went downstairs and began preparing what Lucy would need to eat when she woke. Soft, easy, nothing that would tax a body that had just spent the night working hard. She moved through the kitchen in the early light and felt the house around her in a way she hadn't let herself feel it before, as though something had shifted in the structure of the place, or in the structure of her own sense of where she was in it. She was not a guest. She was not a hired hand, though she was that technically. She was not the woman all three men had rejected, though Red Hollow would probably carry that version of her for a while longer. She was the person who had been in this house on the worst night it had seen in a long time, and she had stayed, and she had done what needed doing, and the house was still standing in the morning. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, close to everything. She was at the stove when she heard Wyatt on the stairs, and then in the kitchen doorway, and she didn't turn around because the porridge needed watching right at that moment, and also because she needed another few seconds to put her face back in order. She woke up, he said, asked for water, and then asked what was for breakfast. Clara smiled at the porridge. Good sign. She asked if you were downstairs. She turned around at that. His face was still carrying everything from the night. The exhaustion, the relief, the openness she'd seen in the doorway of Lucy's room. He looked like a man who had been reduced to what was actually in him, with nothing left for pretense. She wanted to know if you'd stayed, he said. Tell her yes, Clara said. He nodded. He stood in the kitchen for another moment, not moving, not saying anything, and she looked at him and understood that he was trying to find a way to say something for which he hadn't yet found words, and she let him stand there as long as he needed. I keep thinking, he said finally, about what this place would look like if you hadn't been here last night. She didn't answer that because she didn't have to. They both knew what the answer was. He walked to the table and sat down heavily, the way a man sat when he was done holding himself upright by sheer effort, and put his face in his hands for a moment. Clara poured him coffee and set it in front of him and went back to the stove. The porridge was nearly ready. Lucy was awake upstairs. Ethan was asleep in the chair with a blanket over him, and somewhere outside Pete would be starting morning chores, and beyond the ranch, Gideon Pratt was still in his house with his note and his patience and his plans, and the Wichita buyer hadn't written back yet, and Hale hadn't found the other notes, and there was still everything ahead of them that had been there before. None of that had been resolved in the night. But something else had, and Clara couldn't have named it exactly, only felt it in the quality of the morning, in the way the kitchen held them both without requiring anything more of either of them than to be what they were, in the specific silence between two people who had passed through something together and come out the other side still standing. She ladled the porridge into a bowl and put a cloth over it to keep it warm for Lucy. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat down at the table across from Wyatt and drank it while the morning came fully through the window, and neither of them said a word, and that was exactly right. Lucy recovered the way children recovered, not gradually, the way adults did, but in a sudden rush, as though her body had decided it was finished being sick and moved on without consulting anyone. By the third day, she was restless. By the fifth, she was arguing about the light food, exactly as Dr. Haggerty had predicted, and Clara held the line exactly as she'd said she would. And Lucy sulked about it with the focused displeasure of a 9-year-old who had recently been through something frightening and had decided that being annoyed about porridge was a safer feeling than the other ones. Clara let her be annoyed. It was a reasonable trade. What changed in the house after that night was not dramatic and did not announce itself. It was more like the way a room changed when someone finally fixed the window that had been letting in cold air. You didn't notice the specific moment the draft stopped, only that at some point you weren't pulling your coat tighter anymore, and the room had become what a room was supposed to be. Ethan was different, not transformed. She would have distrusted a transformation, would have felt she'd somehow engineered it, which wasn't what she'd wanted. He was just different in the way of someone who had decided, privately and without fanfare, to stop spending energy on a particular kind of resistance. He still didn't talk much. He still had the quality of watching everything from a slight remove, storing it, turning it over in private. But he came into the kitchen in the mornings without staging his arrival, without the careful architecture of someone who had decided in advance how much of themselves to let into the room. He just came in and sat down. Once, about a week after Lucy's fever broke, He put a piece of his carving on the table in front of Clara without comment. Not the bird from the windowsill, something new, a smaller piece, rougher, still in progress. A horse, she thought, though it was early enough in the work that it could still become something else. She looked at it carefully. She didn't pick it up without asking. "Can I?" she said. He shrugged in the way that meant yes. She picked it up and turned it in her hands and felt where the cuts were deep and where they were hesitant and where his hands had clearly known what they wanted and gone directly for it. "The neck's good," she said. "It's not right yet." "No, but the intention's right. That's harder to get than the technique." He looked at her sidelong. "How do you know?" "My mother sewed. I watched her work for years. The ones who were technically correct but didn't know what they wanted made things that were accurate and cold. She always said you could feel the difference." He took the piece back and looked at it differently. Not like he'd decided she was right, but like he was checking what she'd said against what he already knew and finding it worth considering. "She taught me what she could," he said, "but she got tired." "She got tired," Clara agreed. "That doesn't mean what she taught you wasn't enough to build on." He put the piece in his pocket. He went outside. He didn't say thank you, and she didn't expect him to. And the next morning, there was a third carving on the kitchen windowsill next to the bird. The horse, still rough, but placed there deliberately, which was its own kind of statement. Lucy came downstairs one morning near the end of her recovery week and found Clara had put a new arithmetic sheet on the table. But alongside it was something else, a thin book, one Clara had found in the trunk in the front room where Margaret had kept some things. A primer on natural sciences with illustrations of plants and insects and the structures of things. She'd asked Wyatt before taking it out, and he'd stood over the trunk for a long moment before saying quietly that Margaret had used it with Ethan and would have wanted Lucy to have it. Lucy sat down and looked at the book for a long time before she opened it. "Did you pick this?" she asked. "Found it," Clara said. "Thought it might suit you." Lucy opened it to the middle and read for a few minutes and then looked up. "Can we do lessons from this instead of just the reader?" "We can do both," Clara said. "Can Ethan come? He knows more about this than me." Clara looked at her. "Does he want to?" "He'll say no," Lucy said, with the calm certainty of a sister who had been studying her brother for 11 years. "But if you ask him when he's already sitting at the table, he'll do it." Clara filed this away and deployed it 2 days later, exactly as specified, and it worked exactly as specified, and she was careful not to let either of them see how much she appreciated Lucy's strategic intelligence. What was harder to navigate was Wyatt. The night of Lucy's fever had stripped something away from him, or stripped something away from the space between them, which wasn't quite the same thing. He was the same man, he did the same work, he came in at the same hours. But the careful neutrality he'd maintained was gone, and what was in its place was less manageable than neutrality, because it was real. He looked at her directly now. He said her name when he wanted her attention instead of clearing his throat or starting a sentence and waiting for her to respond. He stayed at the kitchen table longer in the evenings, sometimes until the lamp needed refilling twice. They talked. Not about large things, mostly. About the ranch, the children, what Hale had found or hadn't found, what Pete had said about the north fence. But sometimes about other things. He asked her once about her mother, what she'd been like, and Clara found herself talking for longer than she'd intended. And he listened with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested rather than someone performing interest. And afterward she sat with the odd, slightly unsettling feeling of having been actually heard. He told her about Margaret once. Not a lot. Just the one story, about how they'd met, which had involved a rainstorm and a borrowed hat, and a long argument about the best way to get from one end of the county to the other that had, apparently, lasted 3 months, because neither of them was willing to admit they'd been wrong about the road. Clara laughed at that, and he smiled, a real one, not the near suggestion of one she'd seen before. And then the smile faded into something more complicated, and she let it fade. She understood that she was not a replacement for Margaret and didn't want to be. She understood that he was a man still carrying a real loss, and that what was developing between them was not erasing that, was happening alongside it, which was both harder and more honest than the alternative. She also understood, with the clear-eyed practicality that had gotten her through the past 2 months, that she had not yet allowed herself to think directly about what it was. She was doing that less successfully as the weeks went on. Hale found the other notes in the second month. He sent a letter to the ranch asking Wyatt to come in, and Wyatt went and came back in the late afternoon with 2 sheets of paper that he spread on the kitchen table and weighted with the salt crock and the sugar jar. 3 notes, he said, all 3 with the same clause. Different ranchers, different years, same language, almost word for word. Clara read them carefully. Pete, who had been at the table eating when Wyatt came in, leaned over and read them too. He's got a template, Pete said. He's got to practice, Clara said, which was the word that mattered. Hale knows this? Hale wrote the letter. He says if we can get the 3rd rancher, Beaumont, the one who lost his land 2 years ago, to give a statement about the conditions under which he signed, and if the language matches closely enough across all 3 documents, there may be grounds for a complaint to the county land office. Maybe, Clara said. Hale said maybe, Wyatt agreed. He's not a man who overpromises. No, Clara said, but maybe is more than we had. She looked at the documents again. The question is whether Beaumont will talk. He lost the land. He might have something to say. Or he might be afraid Pratt will come after what he has left. Wyatt looked at her. You think like a lawyer. I think like someone who has counted out $14.30 and understood that what you have left is the thing you're most afraid to lose, she said. Beaumont has a family somewhere on that land that's now Pratt's. He's not going to put what he has left at risk without a reason. What's the reason? Clara thought about it. That if Pratt does it to someone else, and someone else after that, eventually there's no one left who had a reason to stop him. She paused. Some people find that argument convincing, especially people who've already watched it happen to themselves. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll go see Beaumont. Take Pete, Clara said. 2 men asking is more formal than 1. Feels more serious. Pete straightened in his chair. I'm coming? If Wyatt agrees, Clara said. Wyatt looked at Pete. Pete shrugged. I've got nothing pressing, he said, which Clara suspected was not entirely true, but was Pete's way of saying he was in. They went to see Beaumont on a Saturday. Clara stayed at the ranch with the children and spent the morning trying not to think about how it was going, which she managed imperfectly. She taught Lucy 2 new chapters from the science primer. She watched Ethan work on the horse carving at the kitchen table and answered questions when he asked them, which happened more than it used to. She made bread, which was the thing she did when she needed something to do with her hands that required consistent attention. They were back by evening. Wyatt came in and sat down, and Clara looked at his face and read it the way she'd learned to read his face, which took some practice because he kept so much of it internal. He'll talk, Wyatt said. Clara put down the knife she was using to cut the bread. What changed his mind? He said. Wyatt stopped, cleared his throat, started again. He said he didn't stop it when he should have. Said he was too scared and too ashamed, and he let a man bully him off land. His father broke his back for, and he'd rather stand up now and maybe lose what he has left than spend another year not being able to look at himself in the morning. The kitchen was quiet. Good man, Pete said from the doorway. Yes, Wyatt said. Clara cut the bread and put it on the table and went to get the butter, and she thought about Beaumont on whatever land he had left with whatever he'd managed to keep, and she thought about choices people made when they were afraid versus the choices they made when they decided the fear wasn't going to make the decision anymore, and she thought about a wagon pulling into Red Hollow and a woman standing on the main street with a suitcase and a hot face and $14 in her pocket. We send everything to Hale on Monday, she said. All 3 documents, Beaumont's statement once he gives it, and your account of Pratt's visit here. I wrote that up already. Wyatt looked at her. You wrote it up. Date, time, what he said, the man with him. I wrote it the afternoon he came. I thought it might matter. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was coming to recognize, the one that showed up when she'd done something he hadn't expected that he should probably have expected by now. Of course you did, he said quietly, and she couldn't tell if it was to her or to himself. The letter to the Wichita buyer had come back 2 weeks earlier, favorable. The terms were better than Abilene, not dramatically, but enough to matter, and the buyer had a reputation for reliability that Pete confirmed from someone he knew who'd done business with him. Wyatt had signed the agreement, and Clara had filed the copy in the ledger she kept, along with notes on what the better terms meant for the quarterly figures, and the picture that emerged was not comfortable but was less dire than it had been. The note to Pratt was still the immediate problem. 8 months from the date of signing was coming down to 5, and Hale had said that even with the complaint, which would take time, they needed to either be in a position to pay the note or to have enough of a legal question around it that Pratt couldn't move on it without risking a public examination he wouldn't want. That was the strategy. Not win outright, not yet, but create enough friction that patience stopped being Pratt's best tool. Clara had laid it out for Wyatt over the kitchen table one evening, going through the ledger page by page, what they could realistically produce before the note came due, what they needed as a buffer, what the Wichita contract provided. She was not telling him what he already knew. She was helping him see it in a shape that he could work with, which was different. The same information arranged differently could feel like a sentence or it could feel like a problem with a solution, and she knew which one he needed. If the fall drive goes at Wichita prices, and if we hold back the two expenses that aren't urgent until after, she said, you're within range. Not there, but within range. Close enough that Hale might have ammunition. Ammunition, Wyatt said. If Pratt moves to call the note early, Hale can argue in the land office that you have a clear and demonstrable path to full payment, that the early collection would be predatory rather than protective of legitimate creditor interest, and that the pattern of behavior with Beaumont and the other rancher supports that characterization. She looked up from the ledger. It's not a guarantee, but it's a case. You've been talking to Hale, he said. I've been corresponding with him, yes. He's sharp. I wanted to understand what the legal frame was. Wyatt sat back. He looked at her with that face again, open, something working behind it that he wasn't saying yet. What? She said. Nothing. He looked at the ledger. I was just thinking about the letter I wrote you, what I thought I was offering. You were offering honest work and a place to stay. I was offering a woman who needed a job, a charity arrangement I dressed up as something useful, he said. That's what I thought when I wrote it. I thought... He stopped. I thought I was doing you a kindness. Clara looked at him. And now? He met her eyes. Now I think you've probably saved this ranch, and I haven't found the right way to say that yet. You don't need to find a way to say it, she said. I know it's true. So do you. That's enough. It's not enough, he said, and there was something in his voice that had shifted into a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not the controlled evenness of a man managing himself, but the plain, slightly difficult sound of someone saying what was actually true. Clara, I need to say something, and I'm going to say it badly because I'm not good at this, and I need you to let me say it badly instead of talking me out of it. She put the pencil down. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. When I came back from Haggerty's that night, when I came up the stairs and you were at the top of them, the way you looked at me so I'd know before I got there. He paused. I thought about that for a long time afterward, about what it meant that there was someone at the top of those stairs. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, and the house made the sounds houses made when the weather moved through, the particular flex and settle of wood that had been standing for 30 years. I'm not asking you anything tonight, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm just telling you that what I feel is not... He stopped again. It's not gratitude. I want you to know it's not gratitude because I think you might think that, and I think that would be wrong. She sat with that for a moment. All right, she said. That's all you're going to say? For tonight, she said. Yes. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and drank what was left of it, which had been cold for an hour. He stood up and said goodnight and went upstairs. And Clara sat at the kitchen table with the ledger in front of her, and felt the house settle around her and thought about the top of a staircase and a man who had looked up and let her see his face. She did not let herself think about it for too long. There was still work to do. What she hadn't expected was Douglas Fell. He came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the conversation in the kitchen, and he had the look of a man who had been working himself up to something for a while and had decided today was the day. Clara was on the porch sweeping when he came up the track, and she recognized him from the road. The build, the way he held the reins, and she kept sweeping. He pulled up and took off his hat. Miss Bennett. Mr. Fell. He looked uncomfortable, which was at least honest. I heard what you did. For the Mercer girl. Word got around. She did most of it herself, Clara said. Fevers break or they don't. Clara. He said her name with the weight that told her where this was going. She kept her face still. I made a mistake, he said. With my cousin, It didn't. She decided she didn't want to come after all. And I've been thinking. He turned his hat. I've been thinking I'd like to start the letters again, if you were willing. She looked at him. He was a decent man. She'd believed that in Abilene when she read his letters, and she believed it now. He had kind eyes, and he'd had the grace to look ashamed when he'd called it off. And the fact that he was here, hat in hand, working up the courage for this, was the kind of thing that took something. I appreciate that, she said. I do. He waited. But no, she said. His face fell, not dramatically. He had enough self-possession for that. Is it because of... He glanced at the house. It's because of me, she said, which was the truest answer. I came here with a list of options, and I've been working through them. This isn't on the list anymore. He looked at her for a moment. He nodded. He put his hat back on. You seem different than the letters, he said, not as a complaint, as an observation. I think I probably am, she said. He said good day and turned his horse and rode back up the track, and she stood on the porch and watched him go and felt nothing in particular, which was its own kind of answer about where she was. Ethan appeared in the doorway behind her. She didn't ask how long he'd been there. Who was that? He said. Someone I used to write letters to. What did he want? To start again. A pause. What did you say? No. Another pause. Longer. Why? She considered the question seriously because he'd asked it seriously. Because the life I came here looking for isn't the one I want anymore, she said. That happens sometimes. You think you're going toward one thing, and somewhere in the middle you find out the thing you actually needed was somewhere else entirely. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, which from Ethan meant he was going to think about that for 3 days and then say something about it when she least expected it. He went back inside. She finished sweeping the porch. When the letter from the county land office came, it came addressed to Wyatt, which was correct, and Clara left it on the desk and did not open it, and told herself she was not watching the clock until he came home, which she was. He came in at his usual time and saw it on the desk, and looked at her and opened it standing up, which told her he didn't want to be sitting down when he read it in case what it said required immediate movement. She watched his face. She had gotten good at reading Wyatt's face. It had taken time. He was not a man whose expressions ran close to the surface, and the codes were subtle. But she knew by now the difference between the jaw set that meant frustration and the one that meant focused, and she knew the particular stillness that meant something had surprised him, and what she saw as he read was something new, something she hadn't cataloged yet. He looked up. Hale filed the complaint, he said. The land office has opened an inquiry into Pratt's loan practices. He looked back at the letter. They're asking for all 3 notes and Beaumont's statement, and... He stopped. And? Clara said. And they want to talk to you, he said. Hale submitted your documentation of Pratt's visit as evidence. The land office wants to take your statement. She sat down. Clara. I'm fine, she said. I didn't expect it to move this fast. Hale said he thinks the timing on Pratt's visit was significant, Wyatt said. Coming here when he knew I wasn't around, so I'm coming to look at the house. He said the way you wrote it up made it read as intentional rather than incidental. It was intentional, she said. That was obvious. Not everyone would have written it down, he said. Same week it happened, same day. She thought about the afternoon of Pratt's visit, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil, writing down everything precisely because she understood that men like Pratt relied on other people not writing things down. What happens now, she said. Hale says the inquiry doesn't stop the note from coming due, but it changes the terrain. Pratt moving on the land while he's under inquiry would be a risk he may not want to take. And if the inquiry goes far enough, he folded the letter. It might go somewhere larger than just the note. He crossed the room and sat down across from her. He put the letter on the table between them. You did this, he said. Hale filed the complaint. Beaumont gave the statement. You, Clara. He said her name the way he'd said it in the kitchen 3 days ago, with that same deliberate weight. You know what I mean. She looked at him across the table. The letter lay between them, 2 pages of formal language that represented months of patient work, documented evidence, a pattern made visible by the simple habit of writing things down. We did it, she said. That's what I know. He looked at her. Something in his face had changed again. Not the openness of the night after Lucy's fever, not the careful distance of the first weeks, but something that sat between them and was real and present and no longer politely ignored. "The children like you," he said. This was clearly not what he'd intended to start with, but it was what came out. "I like them," she said. "Ethan put that horse on the windowsill," he said. "I noticed. He hasn't put anything on any windowsill in a year and a half." She didn't say anything. She let him find his way. "I told you the other night that I wasn't asking anything," he said. "That's still true. I'm not asking. He stopped. "I'm saying that this house is different than it was 4 months ago. The children are different. He put his hand flat on the table, not reaching toward her, just placing it there, a plain gesture of presence. "I'm different," he said, "and I know why." Clara looked at his hand on the table. She looked at his face. "Wyatt," she said, and he went still the way he went still when something mattered. "I came here with $14.30 and a list of options, and none of the options were good," she said. "And I knocked on your door anyway because the letter was honest and I didn't have anything left to lose." She paused. "I don't have that excuse anymore. I have something to lose now. Several things." He waited. "So I'm being careful," she said. "Not because I don't know what I feel, because I know exactly what I feel, and I want to do it right." He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face was something she thought she could probably look at for a long time without getting tired of it. Not simple, not uncomplicated, but real and present and directed at her. "All right," he said. "That's all you're going to say?" she said. Something moved across his face that was almost amusement. "For tonight," he said. "Yes." She smiled at that because he'd thrown her own words back at her with enough precision that she knew he'd been holding them for 3 days, which told her everything about the kind of man he was. Patient, careful, not saying things until he was sure they were right. Lucy's voice came from upstairs, asking about something, and Ethan's voice answered her, which was still new enough to be worth noticing. The house settled around them in the evening light, and Clara picked up the letter from the table and refolded it carefully along its original creases. And Wyatt stood up to go start the evening chores, and outside Red Hollow was going about its business, in the way small towns went about their business, full of its own concerns, its own version of the people living in it, its own opinions about a woman who'd arrived with a suitcase and 3 failed prospects and had instead done something nobody had written into anyone's letters. She set the letter on the desk where it belonged and went to start dinner, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something ordinary and necessary and good. And the carved bird and the rough horse stood on the windowsill in the last of the evening light, and the house held what it had in it, which was, by any honest measure, considerably more than it had held 4 months ago. The inquiry moved slowly, the way official things moved, with the particular bureaucratic patience that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with process. Hale had warned them it would take time, weeks, possibly months before the land office rendered any formal finding, and Clara had accepted that because she understood by now that the things worth having rarely arrived on the schedule you wanted them on. What the inquiry did immediately was what she'd hoped it would do. It created friction. Pratt was not a stupid man, and a stupid man would have pushed forward on the note regardless, called it early, taken the land, and dared anyone to make something of it afterward. Pratt understood that the moment he moved aggressively on the Mercer property, while the land office had his name on a document, he stopped being a patient businessman and started being a man who looked like he had something to hide. And men who looked like they had something to hide did not stay patient businessmen for long in a county where the land office was already watching. So he waited. And while he waited, the fall cattle drive happened. Wyatt took the herd to Wichita in late September with Pete and 2 men hired for the drive, and Clara managed the ranch with Ethan's help, which was not a small thing, because Ethan at 11 was genuinely useful in ways that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the fact that he'd been watching his father work this land since he could walk and had absorbed more of it than anyone had given him credit for. He fed and watered the remaining stock without being told, patched a section of fence that had started to lean before it became a problem, and woke Clara at 3 in the morning one night because he'd heard something in the yard that turned out to be a coyote but could have been worse, and he'd been right to check. She told him so. He didn't say much in response, but he stood a little differently after that. Not taller exactly, more settled, like something had been confirmed that he'd been uncertain about. Lucy spent the week of the drive teaching herself the next 3 chapters of the science primer and producing a series of written observations about the behavior of the 2 barn cats that was, Clara thought, genuinely methodical in a way that would have made a proper scientist nod. She showed it to Clara with the careful casualness of someone trying not to look like they cared about the response. "This is good work," Clara said, and meant it. Lucy looked at the pages. "Do you think there are women who do this? Study things?" "Yes," Clara said. "Not as many as there should be, but yes." Lucy considered this with the gravity she brought to everything that actually mattered to her. "I think I might want to do that," she said. "Study things." "Then study things," Clara said. "Papa might think it's strange." "Your father," Clara said, "is a man who hired a woman he'd never met to run his household and then let her look at his ledgers. I don't think strange is the word he reaches for first." Lucy smiled at that. A real one, not the careful provisional kind she'd started with. She put her observations away in the folder Clara had given her for exactly this purpose and went to find Ethan, and Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment thinking about a 9-year-old girl deciding she wanted to study things, and what it would take to make sure that desire didn't get talked out of her by the time she was old enough to act on it. That was a project for another day. There were enough projects already. Wyatt came back from Wichita on a Thursday, arriving in the yard in the late afternoon with Pete and the 2 hired men, and a tiredness that went bone deep, the way the tiredness of a long drive did, settling into a man and staying there for days. But the tiredness had something else in it. He came into the kitchen and sat down and put an envelope on the table. Clara looked at it. She looked at him. "Wichita prices," he said. "Held where we needed them. Better than last year." She picked up the envelope and did the arithmetic in her head against the figures she'd been carrying for 2 months. She put it down. "It's enough," she said, "to pay the note." "To pay the note and have something left," she said. "Not much, but something." He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. Not with grief this time. Not with the weight of the night after Lucy's fever, but with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been holding something up for a very long time and had just been told he could set it down. "We should tell Hale first," Clara said, "before we pay Pratt. Hale should know the note is being satisfied in full before the due date, and it should be documented that Pratt accepts it, and the documentation should go to the land office." Wyatt looked up. "You want to make sure he can't claim we were still in default." "I want to make sure every action from this point forward is on paper and witnessed," Clara said. "Pratt has shown us who he is. We don't stop being careful just because we're paying him off." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "we don't." The payment was made 2 weeks later through Hale's office with 2 witnesses present and a receipt that Hale drafted himself and had signed in triplicate, one for Wyatt, one for Pratt, one for the land office inquiry file. Pratt came in person, which Clara had not expected, and she heard about it from Wyatt that evening. "He was pleasant," Wyatt said, with the tone of a man describing something faintly disturbing. Said he was glad it could be settled cleanly. Said he hoped there were no hard feelings. "What did you say?" "I said I appreciated the loan at a difficult time," Wyatt said. "Hale told me beforehand to keep it neutral." "Good advice." "Hale also said—" Wyatt paused. "He said the inquiry is still open. Paying off the note doesn't close the inquiry. The land office is interested in the practice itself, not just the specific situation." Clara thought about Beaumont, on whatever land he had left. "Good," she said. "He said it might come to something for Beaumont. Getting something back, or compensation. He wasn't certain." "He never is." "No." A pause. "Hale said you have good instincts for documentation." "My mother's accounts," Clara said. "You say that a lot." "She taught me a lot." She looked at the ledger on the desk, which had a different quality now. Still necessary, but no longer carrying the particular weight of urgency it had for months. She used to say that the difference between people who got through hard things and people who didn't was rarely courage. It was usually record-keeping. Wyatt looked at her. "That's a very practical philosophy." She was a very practical woman. "So are you," he said. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, and the way he said it had no ambiguity in it whatsoever. She did not look at him for a moment longer than necessary, because she was aware that the conversation they'd been not quite having for 2 months was getting closer to the surface, and she was not entirely ready, which was an unusual feeling for her. Clara Bennett had generally found that readiness was a thing you manufactured through action rather than waited to arrive. But this was different. This mattered in a way she was not accustomed to things mattering, and the unfamiliarity of that was its own kind of caution. What moved things, in the end, was not a conversation. It was a morning in October when the first real cold of the season came in overnight, and the kitchen was dark and close and warm from the stove, and Lucy came downstairs to find Clara at the table with her tea and climbed up into the chair beside her the way she'd started doing, settling in, not requiring anything, just being in the same space. And then Ethan came down and sat across from them and picked up the piece of carving he'd left on the table the night before. And they were all three there in the early quiet when Wyatt came in from the barn with cold air on his coat and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the three of them at the table. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Lucy said, "There's tea," and Wyatt came in and sat down, and the four of them were at the table in the early morning dark with the stove ticking and the cold outside. And Clara looked at the three of them and felt something she had no precise language for. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple a word for something that had this much complexity in it, this much history and imperfection and work. But something that was in the same family as happiness, something that had roots. Wyatt asked her to marry him on a Saturday in November. He didn't do it dramatically. He didn't do it with any of the things she might have expected from a man proposing, no particular setting, no preparation she could see. He did it in the barn, of all places, while she was helping him work out a problem with a section of harness that had been giving him trouble, and she was holding one end of it, and he was threading the other through a buckle. And he said, without looking up from what he was doing, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it where there isn't a table between us because I have a feeling you're less likely to talk me out of it if there's no table." She looked at the top of his head. "That's a very specific theory. I've had time to think about it." He got the buckle through and looked up. His face was what it always was now. Open, real, no performance. "Will you marry me?" It was not a question, quite. It had the quality of a statement he was making about what he wanted and was now waiting to hear whether she agreed. She looked at him in the barn in the November light. This man who had written her an honest letter when everyone else in Red Hollow had already written her off, who had let her look at his ledgers and his grief and his children and his broken harness, who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "Yes," she said. He nodded, as though this confirmed something he'd been fairly sure of but had needed to hear. He looked back at the harness. "We'll talk to the children tonight," he said. "All right. Lucy will probably cry." "Probably," Clara agreed. "Ethan will pretend he already knew." "He did already know," Clara said. Wyatt looked up again. "How long?" "About 6 weeks," she said. "He's been watching us." Wyatt made a sound that was somewhere between amusement and resignation, and they finished with the harness, and Clara walked back to the house with the particular feeling of a woman who had just made a decision that was both enormous and obvious, which was the best kind of decision, the kind that felt inevitable once you'd made it, as though the answer had been waiting in the question all along. Lucy did cry, briefly, and then immediately began asking practical questions about whether anything would change about the sleeping arrangements and whether Clara would still teach her lessons, both of which Clara answered directly, and the crying stopped in favor of calculation, which was very Lucy. Ethan said, "Okay," and looked at his father, and then at Clara, and then back at his carving. And Clara saw in the set of his shoulders something that was not indifference. It was the posture of someone who had gotten the thing they wanted and was not going to make a production of it. Later that night, she found a small piece of carved wood on the pillow in her room. Not the bird, not the horse. Something new, something she had to look at for a moment before she understood what it was. A figure, small and simply made, a woman standing with her hands at her sides, not posed, not idealized, just standing in the way people stood when they were somewhere they intended to stay. She held it in her hand for a long time. They were married in December by the county justice of the peace in the front room of the Mercer house, with Pete as witness and Mrs. Caldwell, who had appointed herself involved and could not be reasonably excluded, and the two children, who stood on either side of them with the solemnity of people who understood that this particular moment had weight. It was not a grand occasion. The front room needed painting, and the floorboard by the window still had a squeak that Wyatt hadn't gotten to yet. And Clara's dress was her best one, but it was not new, and Mrs. Caldwell brought a cake that was slightly lopsided on one side because her oven ran hot. None of that mattered in the way that things that don't matter. What mattered was that when the justice asked Wyatt if he took this woman, he looked at Clara the whole time the words were being said, and not at anyone else. And what was in his face was the face of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had thought about it long enough to be certain. What mattered was that when Lucy reached up and took Clara's hand partway through, small fingers closing around hers without any self-consciousness, Clara did not lose her composure, but it was a closer thing than she would have admitted to anyone. What mattered was that Ethan, standing beside his father, had the carved woman in his coat pocket. She'd seen him put it there that morning. He hadn't said anything about it. She hadn't said anything about it. Some things you left alone, and some things you left alone because they were already exactly right. Red Hollow took some time to adjust, as small towns did, because small towns built their stories about people and did not easily rebuild them. Clara knew that the version of her that existed in certain conversations, the woman 3 men had refused, the one Wyatt Mercer had taken in out of necessity, would not disappear overnight. Stories were stubborn things. People held on to them because they gave shape to the world, and asking someone to give up a shape they'd gotten comfortable with was asking something real. But the inquiry finding came through in January, and that changed things in a way that the gossip hadn't prepared Red Hollow for. The land office found that Gideon Pratt had engaged in a pattern of predatory lending using deliberately ambiguous contractual language designed to allow early collection at his discretion rather than for legitimate creditor protection. The finding did not constitute a criminal proceeding, it was a civil administrative matter, but it did constitute a formal record, and the land office issued a set of conditions on Pratt's future lending activity in the county that amounted to making his particular method impossible going forward. Beaumont received a formal apology and a modest financial remedy. The rancher who had lost his land did not get it back, which was the part that sat hardest with Clara, because justice administered after the fact always had that quality. It could stop the next one more easily than it could undo the last one, but it stopped the next one. That was something. When the finding became known in Red Hollow, Clara's name appeared in it, not as a plaintiff, not as a party, but as the source of the documented account of Pratt's visit that had, Hale said, been instrumental in establishing the pattern of intentional targeting. A woman with a pencil and a habit of writing down what she observed, at the right time and in the right form. Mrs. Caldwell told everyone she'd seen it coming from the day Clara arrived, which was not entirely accurate but was so thoroughly delivered that most people in town began to believe they'd seen it coming too, which Clara found more entertaining than she probably should have. Harold Briggs caught her arm at the general store on a day in February. Not his store, the other one. But he'd come in on some errand and there she was, and he had the decency to look like a man who had some accounting to do. "Miss Bennet," he said, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Mercer." "Mr. Briggs?" she said. He turned his hat. "I said something when you arrived that was... It wasn't..." He stopped. "It wasn't right," he said. She looked at him. He was a man who'd said an unkind thing on a public street to a woman he'd never met, and the unkind thing had gotten louder in his own memory as time went on, which was what happened to unkind things when the person who'd been unkind had to keep watching the person they'd been unkind to go on and do well. She didn't feel triumph about that. She didn't feel much of anything about Harold Briggs anymore, which was its own kind of information. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, and bought what she'd come for and went home. Home. She thought about that word on the walk back, the way it had changed in her mouth over the past months. Not a concept, not a destination, but a specific and actual place that had the squeak in the floorboard and the lopsided cake and 2 children and a man with careful eyes and the carved bird and the rough horse and now the small standing figure all on the kitchen windowsill in a row. She had come to Red Hollow with a list of options. None of the options on that list had been this. She hadn't known to write it down because she hadn't known it existed, which was the thing she thought about most often when she thought about what the whole of it meant. People talked about knowing what they wanted as though it were a fixed thing, as though you could identify it once and aim at it, and the aiming would be the hardest part. What Clara had learned, in the boarding house with $14, on the road north with her suitcase, in a kitchen at 2 in the morning with a basin of cool water and a child burning with fever, was that you often didn't know what you needed until you were already in the middle of it, and the most important skill was not the ability to aim at the right thing from a distance, but the ability to recognize the right thing when you were standing in it. She'd almost missed it. That was the part she sat with sometimes, quietly and alone. How close she'd come to taking Cal Peter's money off the trough and buying a ticket back east. How the decision to push that envelope through the mail slot instead of putting it in her pocket had been made in a moment of pride that had nothing to do with wisdom and everything to do with the simple refusal to be bought off. And how that refusal, which had felt like stubbornness, had been the thing that kept her in Red Hollow long enough for Wyatt Mercer's letter to find her. There was no lesson in that exactly. You couldn't tell someone to be stubborn in the right direction at the right moment, as though it were a skill you could practice. But she thought there was something in it about what happened when you stopped treating rejection as a verdict. Harold Briggs laughing on the main street of Red Hollow had felt like a verdict. The whole day had felt like a verdict, the way some days did. Final, sealed, the story over. It hadn't been the story over. It had been the story starting. She told Lucy this once, not as a lesson. She was careful about framing things as lessons, because Lucy was sharp enough to tune out anything that sounded like it was being taught to her. But in the course of a conversation about something else, naturally, the way things came out when they were true. Lucy thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "So the bad thing was actually part of the good thing." "Sometimes," Clara said. "Not always. Sometimes the bad thing is just a bad thing." "How do you know which one?" "You mostly don't while you're in it," Clara said. "That's the hard part." Lucy chewed on this in the way she chewed on everything that interested her, thoroughly and at her own pace. "I think that's a very annoying feature," she said finally. Clara laughed, a real one, sudden, surprised out of her. "Yes," she said, "it really is." The ranch did not become prosperous overnight. That was not how ranches worked, and Clara had no illusions about the pace of recovery. It was slow and incremental, and there were months that were better and months that weren't, and the work was never finished because the work on a working ranch was by definition never finished. But it moved. It moved in the right direction, steadily, and the Wichita contract held through the next year. And the second year, Wyatt negotiated terms that were better still, and Pete stayed on and became something closer to family than employee, which everyone pretended not to notice because Pete would have been embarrassed by the noticing. Ethan grew, not just in height, though that too. He shot up in the year after the inquiry and suddenly had his father's build without quite having finished being a boy, which produced the peculiar awkwardness of early adolescence that Clara navigated by continuing to treat him as what he was, a person of genuine intelligence who was in the process of figuring out how to carry it. He read everything he could get his hands on. He asked questions about the land, the water, the soil, the way the creek ran in wet years and dry years, with the focused curiosity of someone for whom these were not academic questions but personal ones. He and Clara had arguments sometimes, real ones, the kind where neither of them gave ground easily, and both of them came out of it having thought harder than when they went in. She would not have traded those arguments for an easier relationship. He still carved. The windowsill had accumulated a small population of figures by the time Clara stopped counting. Animals mostly, but other things too. A fence post with a bird on it, a hand holding a tool, small precise observations of the world around him rendered in wood with an attention she found moving every time she looked at them. He never talked about them as art. She never called them that. But she made sure the windowsill was dusted and the light was good, and he noticed that, and that was enough. Lucy studied things. She studied them with an intensity that required redirection occasionally into also eating meals and sleeping. But Clara had decided early that misdirected passion was easier to work with than absent passion, and she let Lucy run long when the science was going well, and pulled her back when the girl had been in the corner with a book for 6 hours and had gone slightly feral. By the time Lucy was 12, she had worked through every text Clara could find her on natural science, and Clara wrote a letter to a woman she'd once corresponded with, a schoolteacher in a city 2 days east who had, in her letters, mentioned connections to a women's educational society. And the return letter had information that made Lucy sit very still for a long time and then say, carefully, "That's a real thing? A school like that is real?" "It's real," Clara said. "Papa would let me go?" "Your father," Clara said, "has 2 things he cares about most where you're concerned, that you're safe and that you're entirely yourself. I don't think he'll stand in the way of the second one." She was right. Wyatt's face when Claire explained the school was the face of a man confronting something he hadn't anticipated and was working out how he felt about it in real time, which involved a long silence, and then, how far? 2 days. Another silence. She's 12. She would go at 14. The silence this time was the longest. Lucy was not in the room, which was strategic. Claire had learned something about timing from Lucy herself. Finally, Wyatt said, "If that's what she wants." "It's what she wants," Claire said. He nodded. He was quiet for another moment. "She's so much like her mother," he said. "Margaret would have—" He stopped. "Let it sit." "She would have liked this," he said. "The idea of Lucy studying things properly." "I know," Claire said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "The way the house was built," Claire said, which was what she always said, and he understood it the way he always did, as the truest thing she knew how to tell him about the woman whose herbs had gone colorless above the kitchen window, and whose handwriting was still on the tins in the pantry, and whose science primer had started Lucy on the path she was now following with all the focused determination of a person who had found out what they were for. That was what Clara thought about sometimes, in the quiet moments the ranch occasionally allowed. Not what she'd found, but what had already been here. The shape of a life that Margaret had started and that grief had interrupted, and that she had not replaced or replicated, but had, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, continued. Different in every particular and continuous in the ways that mattered. She had come here as a stranger. She was not a stranger anymore, and the change had been so gradual that she couldn't have pointed to the moment it happened, only to the fact that it had, the way belonging always happened, not in the dramatic moments, but in the accumulated ordinary ones, the mornings and the meals and the arguments and the long evenings and the crises endured and the small, specific knowledge of a place and the people in it that built up slowly into something that held. She was in the kitchen on a late afternoon in the third year, the light coming through the window at the angle. It came at that particular time of day when she looked up and saw the windowsill, the carved bird, the rough horse, the standing woman. 3 other figures she hadn't catalogued in a while. A dog she didn't recognize, a fence post, something that might have been a book. She went and stood at the window and looked at them for a moment. Outside, Wyatt was crossing the yard toward the barn. Ethan was at the fence line doing something with wire that required his full attention and both hands. Lucy was somewhere in the house, quiet in the way she was quiet when the thinking was going well. The house settled around her in the late light. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and she had stopped expecting otherwise and found that she didn't mind. The work was the life, not the thing keeping her from it. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood when she arrived with her list of options and her pencil and her careful, frightened hope. You didn't work your way to the life and then rest in it. The working was the living, the daily unremarkable presence was the thing. She looked at the carved figures on the windowsill. She looked at the yard where Wyatt was disappearing into the barn. She thought about a woman on a main street in Red Hollow, with a suitcase and a hot face and no good options, and the specific stubbornness that had kept her from taking the easy way out. She was glad, every day, for that stubbornness. She did not think she could have known then that it was the right call. She had not known. She had only refused and then kept moving, and the moving had brought her here. That was not a lesson she could hand to anyone. But it was the truth, and she had always, even when it cost her, preferred the truth to the easier thing. She went back to work. The light moved across the kitchen floor. The way light moved in that house, slowly and at a particular angle that changed with the season, and the carved figures stood on the windowsill in their small row, and outside the ranch went on being what it was, imperfect, demanding, alive. And inside, Clara Mercer stood at her kitchen counter in the late afternoon of a life she had not planned and thought, with the plain and unadorned certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the real thing when she was standing in it, that this was exactly where she belonged.
Oh, that scratches that ADHD itch. The Wubs. We watched Send Help. It's a horror comedy with Rachel McAdams. Oh, you know what? I have to say, when it's a comedy horror, okay, when it's something like that, I can handle horror because it's funny, you know? But sometimes it kind of depends on the movie, right? But that sounds like something I could probably watch. Like that one, I think it was called like A Cabin in the Woods or something, like the comedy horror. I can't remember who was in it, but it was like it was really fucking funny, if I recall. Directed by San Remi or San Rami. I'm probably saying their name wrong. Wait, was that the guy who has a show on Hello Wispy, welcome in, dropping in on you. Oh my goodness, they're dropping in.